Chapter 1. The Unseen Arrival. There was nothing extraordinary about the day when Caden Cole was first contacted by an unknown source. He woke up late. As usual, the soft hum of his ship's engines the only sound that broke the silence of his isolated quarters. He had been traveling the galaxy for the better part of a decade, a lone mechanic turned freelance transporter with a knack for keeping ships in top shape, even if his passengers were sometimes more trouble than they were worth. Today seemed like another ordinary day of small tasks and routine fixes on his freighter, the Nomad. A rusty, weathered hulk of a ship that had once been the pride of a great fleet, now reduced to a barely functioning relic of its former glory. But for Caden, it was home, and that was all he needed. He shuffled through his morning routine, the grind of his life more ingrained in him than he cared to admit. The scrape of his boots against the cold metal floor, the clink of tools as he got them ready, the crackle of the old communication console as it sputtered to life. The silence between him and the cosmos was a constant companion, and he had learned to cherish it. He'd lived in the deep reaches of space long enough to understand that the only noise worth hearing was the hum of your own existence, the sound of your ship's life force resonating through the air as you made your way from one barren planet to another. But when he sat down in the cockpit to check in with his navigation system, something was different. His console blinked with an unfamiliar alert, a flashing message that didn't quite look like the standard communications he usually received. His brow furrowed in confusion as he reached forward, fingers brushing the screen to open the transmission. The message was short, cryptic, and chilling in its brevity. There was no identification, no standard introduction. Just a simple, haunting command. No one can hear you. Hold me close and make me yours. Caden blinked, reading the message again to make sure he wasn't seeing things. He could feel the blood drain from his face as the words began to sink in. The strange message made no sense, and yet it stirred something in him, a deep, inexplicable urge to respond. It wasn't the words themselves that had such an impact, but the underlying tone, the sense of desperation that bled through each syllable. Whoever had sent this message was in trouble, and Caden's instincts, honed over years of working in space, told him that trouble was something he could never ignore. He leaned back in his chair, trying to make sense of it. No one could send a message like this without having a reason. There was no way someone would reach out with such an intense and intimate plea without having a very good reason. The words kept echoing in his head, as if they were written in a language he didn't understand but still felt the weight of. The longer he stared at the blinking message, the more the mystery tugged at him. Something wasn't right, but the feeling in his gut urged him to investigate. He tapped into the ship's systems, scanning for the signal's source. A part of him tried to convince himself that this was some kind of prank or perhaps a malfunction in the communication network. But as he traced the coordinates, the sense of unease grew stronger. The signal was coming from a remote, uncharted sector of space, a place so far off the regular trade routes that even the most experienced navigators avoided it. It was a graveyard of sorts, filled with derelict ships and dead planets. No one went there unless they had a death wish. Caden cursed under his breath. He should have known better. But something in that message pulled at him, a call to action he couldn't ignore. The professional side of him knew this was a bad idea. This wasn't the kind of mission he usually took. He didn't chase ghosts or get involved in the mess of someone else's problems. But the human side of him, the one that had long since abandoned any grand ideals of adventure, could feel that sense of empathy starting to creep in. He was already moving before his brain could catch up with his body. The autopilot kicked in, and he set the course for the coordinates. There was no going back now. The moment Caden touched the controls and began his approach to the unknown freighter, a strange, magnetic pull seemed to tug at his very being. The universe outside the cockpit was the same vast emptiness that had always been there, the stars in the distance glittering like cold diamonds. Yet, now, it felt as if something beyond the ordinary was waiting for him, something that could alter the course of his life in ways he could not yet comprehend. As he neared the ghost ship, a sense of unease filled him, the hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention. The freighter looked ancient, its dark, metallic hull marred by deep gouges and scars of a hard life, while the faintest glow of life support systems barely flickered through the portholes. There was something about it that spoke of forgotten things, of time buried deep in the recesses of space. The ship felt alive in its own quiet way, but not in a way that would comfort anyone. Caden's hands tightened around the controls, guiding the Nomad closer to the airlock of the freighter. He had done this countless times approaching unknown vessels, dockings, quick fixes, salvage runs, but this felt different. Everything in him screamed to turn back, yet there was a force pulling him forward. He couldn't explain it. Something in the pit of his stomach told him that walking away would be a mistake, perhaps one that he couldn't undo. He docked the ship with a soft, metallic thud and ran a diagnostic check on the systems. The freighter's exterior was far from pristine, but the life support systems hummed faintly. In the eerie silence that enveloped the surroundings, Caden grabbed his toolkit, checking his plasma cutter and making sure his blaster was within reach. He wasn't expecting trouble, but in the outer rim, you never knew what kind of danger lurked in the shadows. The airlock on the freighter creaked as it opened, releasing a cloud of stale air that carried a faint metallic smell. There was no one to greet him, no crew, no sign of life. Caden hesitated for only a moment before stepping across the threshold. His boots clicked on the cold metal floor as he moved deeper into the bowels of the ship. Every step echoed, but the silence around him felt unnatural, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. He paused in the hallway, scanning his surroundings. Everything seemed normal, as normal as an abandoned ship could be. The walls were lined with faded, worn consoles that flickered intermittently, and old, dusty cargo containers were scattered across the hall. Yet, as he ventured deeper into the ship, the silence grew oppressive. It wasn't the quiet of a typical abandoned freighter, where the remnants of crew members' hurried escape left their traces behind. No, this felt intentional, like the ship had been waiting for him. Then, in the distance, he saw a flash of light coming from the cargo hold. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. His heart skipped a beat. Something was alive down there. He wasn't alone. With a mixture of curiosity and growing apprehension, Caden made his way toward the hold, his footsteps quickening as he moved. The flickering light led him into the bowels of the ship, down narrow, dimly lit hallways that seemed to stretch into infinity. Finally, he reached the door to the cargo hold, which was ajar. His hand hesitated over the door's control panel, but before he could open it fully, a soft sound caught his attention. It was faint at first, almost a whisper, like the sound of fabric brushing against metal. It was followed by a low, soft gasp. Caden's breath caught in his throat as he pushed the door open, slowly stepping inside. The first thing he saw was her, the alien woman. She was standing in the shadows of the dimly lit cargo hold, her silhouette sharp against the pale blue glow of the cargo lights. Her body was delicate yet strong, her movements fluid and precise as she stepped forward, her violet skin shimmering faintly under the light. Her hair flowed in long waves, deep black, catching the light as she tilted her head to look at him. Her eyes, those eyes were the most striking feature. They were not the color of any human eyes he had ever seen. They were a glowing, emerald green, piercing and intense, as though she could see through the very fabric of his soul. Caden froze in place, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The sight of her so alien, yet so undeniably human in some strange, unsettling way made his heart race. She was unlike anything he had encountered in all his years of travel. Her beauty was intoxicating, but there was something haunting about it too. Something that made him feel like a mere observer in a world far beyond his understanding. For a moment, the room was still. Neither of them moved, and the silence stretched between them like a web, fragile yet taut. Caden didn't know what to say, didn't know how to react. Then, with a voice that was soft but firm, she spoke. "I need your help." Chapter 2, The Request. Caden's pulse thudded in his ears, his mind racing as he absorbed her words. The way she spoke wasn't with fear, but with a quiet urgency, as though she knew exactly what she wanted but wasn't sure how to ask for it. It wasn't the kind of request he had ever heard before, not from anyone or anything he had ever met. "I don't know who you are," Caden said, his voice hoarse, "but I can help you. I can fix ships, I can get you back to civilization, but I dash." "Not that kind of help," she interrupted, her voice trembling just slightly. There was a weight in her words, a weight that spoke of desperation. "I need your help, to survive." Her words hung in the air, the tension thickening between them. Caden blinked, not understanding. "Survive?" He glanced at her closely, his brow furrowing. There was something about her, something in her stance, in the way her chest rose and fell with every breath that suggested she wasn't just a wanderer in space, someone lost and alone. She was more than that. She was more than he could possibly understand. Why me? Caden asked, still struggling to make sense of the situation. His instincts were telling him to step back, to run, but there was an undeniable curiosity pulling him in. Why contact me? I had no choice, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes locked with his, and there was a deep sadness in them, a haunted look that spoke of loss, of fear, of things she had seen that had shattered her. My people, they're gone. And now, they're hunting me. You don't know who they are, but you'll come to understand. They're coming for me. And they'll come for you too, once they know you've helped me. Her words struck him like a physical blow. His mind raced, trying to catch up. Her people were gone. And now she was being hunted. He wasn't sure what kind of world she had come from, but the warning was clear. Whatever was hunting her was something far beyond anything he could comprehend. But I don't know how to help you, Caden said, his voice shaking slightly as he stepped closer to her. I'm just a mechanic. Her eyes softened, and she took a step forward, closing the space between them. You don't need to know how, Caden. You just need to be willing to help me. They will come for me whether I'm ready or not. Whether you're ready or not. Caden hesitated, feeling the weight of her gaze on him, the intensity of her presence overwhelming him. She wasn't asking for him to fight, or even to make sense of her world. She was asking him for something more basic, more primal, trust. And in that moment, for reasons he couldn't fully understand, he realized he couldn't say no. I'll help you, he said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. Whatever you need. I don't know what's going on, but I'm not leaving you alone. Her expression softened, and for the first time since he had entered the ship, she gave him a small, fleeting smile. It was the kind of smile that held both gratitude and sorrow. And then, she spoke again, her words trembling with an emotion he couldn't quite place. Thank you, Caden. You don't know what this means, what it could mean for both of us. Caden stared at her, his mind still racing as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He had just agreed to help a mysterious alien woman, someone with glowing green eyes and a desperate plea for survival. Someone who had just told him that he would be in danger now as well. He had stepped into a world of unknowns, a place where everything he thought he knew about life, space, and survival was suddenly called into question. Her name, he realized, had not been spoken, and neither had the name of the threat she was running from. She looked at him, her eyes softening with a mixture of relief and sorrow. She wasn't just a stranger anymore, she was someone who had been abandoned, hunted, and lost. That much was clear in the way her shoulders sagged with exhaustion, the subtle trembling of her hands as she tried to mask the fear that still gripped her. I'm Lyra, she said, her voice gentle, but there was an undercurrent of sadness beneath it. She took a hesitant step toward him, her violet skin shimmering in the low light. Thank you for helping me. I didn't expect anyone to respond. I didn't think anyone would care. Caden nodded, trying to process everything, but he couldn't help but wonder how she ended up in this situation. An alien, seemingly alone, hunted by forces beyond her understanding. He had no idea what kind of threat could be so terrifying that she had no other option but to trust a stranger, a mechanic with no weapons, no knowledge of her world. He was about to ask her more questions when the ship's systems beeped, a warning light flashing across his console. That's not good, Caden muttered to himself, hurrying back to the cockpit. Lyra followed him quickly, her steps almost soundless despite the weight of the situation. What's wrong? She asked, her voice tight with tension. Caden pointed at the flashing red lights. We've got company. Someone's pinging us, and it's not a commercial ship. I've got a bad feeling about this. Lyra's face shifted in an instant, a hard edge replacing the previous vulnerability. Her eyes flickered with determination, and Caden could see the change in her. She was no longer the helpless woman from the cargo hold. She was now the person who had been running, surviving, and who had faced countless threats without flinching. They found me, Lyra said quietly, her voice barely audible, but the certainty in her tone made it clear that she had dealt with this before. Who's found you? Caden asked, his voice rising slightly with the stress of the situation. Lyra's gaze hardened. The Wardens, she said flatly. They're a force like no other. Ruthless, powerful, and they never forget. They'll hunt me down. And now, They found you too. Caden's heart skipped a beat. The Wardens? He had never heard of them, but the sheer certainty in her voice made him understand that these weren't just any ordinary bounty hunters or law enforcement. These were beings who commanded fear across the galaxy. Can we outrun them? Caden asked, his eyes glued to the screen as the unknown ship closed in on their position. Lyra shook her head, her expression grim. We can't outrun them. They'll follow us across galaxies if they have to. But there's one thing we can do. Caden turned to her, his brow furrowed. What's that? Fight, she said simply. Caden stared at her, disbelief making his mouth go dry. Fight? What are you talking about? We're on a ship with barely enough power to get us out of this sector, let alone take on an enemy. You're out of your mind if you think dash. There's no choice, Lyra interrupted, her voice steady. We can't run forever. And if we don't fight now, you'll never see another sunrise. You'll never see Earth again. They'll kill you too. Caden's mind was reeling. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even someone who had fought in any kind of meaningful way. He had spent his life repairing ships, flying under the radar, and staying as far from trouble as possible. But Lyra was right. There was no going back now. He was in this, whether he liked it or not. Okay, he said, his voice steadying. Tell me what I need to do. Lyra moved to the control panel, her movements fluid as she worked quickly. We need to be ready. I'll prep the weapons, but I'll need you to help me. I can't do this alone. Caden swallowed hard, glancing back at her. Weapons. I've been keeping a few things hidden on this ship, she said, not looking at him as she quickly accessed various systems. And you might not think it's enough, but it'll have to do. We don't have the luxury of choice anymore. The ship's lights flickered once, then steadied. Lyra's hands moved over the controls with precision, almost as if the ship had become an extension of herself. It was clear that she knew exactly what she was doing. This was a life she had led for a long time. She didn't trust anyone, but Caden had no choice but to trust her now. There's a weapons locker in the cargo hold, Lyra said as she moved quickly to another console. I'll meet you there. Don't take too long. They're coming. Caden hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He turned on his heel and made his way back to the cargo hold, his thoughts spinning faster than his feet could carry him. He had never been in a real fight before. Sure, he'd had to defend himself against a few thieves here and there, but nothing like this. Nothing that could determine whether he lived or died. The weapons locker was located at the back of the cargo hold, and when Caden opened it, his eyes widened at the array of equipment Lyra had hidden away. Guns, energy blades, grenades, all tools of warfare he was unaccustomed to handling. He pulled a small blaster from the shelf and checked it quickly, his hands shaking slightly. It was heavier than he expected, and it felt strange in his grip, but it was better than nothing. He moved quickly to the cockpit, where Lyra was already prepping the ship. Ready? She asked, her voice calm and collected, though there was a fire in her eyes. She was prepared for what was coming. But him? He wasn't so sure. As ready as I'll ever be, Caden replied, trying to sound confident. Without another word, Lyra engaged the ship's engines, and the Nomad lurched forward as they shot out of the dead sector and into open space. Behind them, the sound of a pursuing ship's engines could be heard, its noise growing louder with each passing second. Caden didn't know what kind of enemy they were up against, but he was about to find out. Chapter 3: The Battle for Survival. The hum of the Nomad's engines filled the cockpit as Lyra engaged the ship's weapons systems, her fingers moving with practiced precision. Caden could hear the growing sound of the pursuing ship's engines behind them, drawing closer by the second. The once quiet, peaceful universe outside the viewport now felt like a battleground, silent, cold, and yet alive with the threat of destruction. His heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the blaster tightly in his hands, the weight of the gun unfamiliar but reassuring in his grasp. Are you sure about this? Caden asked, his voice strained, as he glanced over at Lyra. She was calm, collected, eyes fixed on the console as she adjusted their trajectory. There's no other choice, she replied, her voice unwavering. We can't run. They'll catch us eventually. We have to fight. Caden nodded, though the uncertainty still gnawed at him. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't even sure if he could hit anything with the blaster, but he was committed now. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. He glanced down at the weapon, checking the settings, trying to ignore the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled in his gut. The ship's alert system began blaring, signaling the incoming attack. Lyra's hands flew across the controls as she adjusted their shields. The lights in the cockpit flickered, the intensity of the moment pressing down on them both. "They're locking onto us," Lyra said, her voice taut with concentration. "Get ready. They won't hold back." Before Kaden could respond, the first blast of energy collided with their shields, sending a jolt through the ship. The entire frame shuddered, and the low hum of the engines faltered for a split second. Kaden gripped the armrests of his seat, his heart hammering in his chest. "That was close," he muttered, adrenaline coursing through him. "They're testing us," Lyra said, her eyes narrowing as she readied the ship's weapons. "We need to throw them off balance. We need to make them think we can fight." She pulled the ship into a sharp, evasive maneuver, the engines roaring as they whipped around, narrowly avoiding the next barrage of shots. The pursuing ship, an ominous black and silver vessel, fired again, this time with more intensity, its lasers cutting through space like searing lightning. Lyra's hands moved swiftly, adjusting their speed and vector. "I'm firing back," she said with a deadly calmness. Kaden braced himself. He had no idea how to fire the weapon, but Lyra didn't seem to care. She turned to him, eyes locked on his. "You have to be ready. Just pull the trigger if you see something. Don't think, just act." Kaden nodded, though the instructions felt like too much for him to absorb in such a short amount of time. But before he could second-guess himself, Lyra hit the fire button, and the ship's cannons erupted with a brilliant, blinding flash. The sound of the blast vibrated through the hull of the ship, followed by the shrill noise of alarms indicating a direct hit. The pursuing ship faltered, briefly losing its grip on their position as its shields flared. Lyra wasted no time, swinging the ship around again to avoid the incoming fire, taking advantage of their brief window of opportunity. Kaden's mind was racing, but his instincts kicked in. He gripped the blaster, raised it toward the cockpit's viewport, and pulled the trigger. A blinding flash of blue light surged from the weapon, and a shockwave reverberated through the ship as the blast hit its target. The pursuing ship lurched violently, its engines flickering as smoke billowed from one of its rear thrusters. Kaden had done it. He'd actually hit something. "I did it," Kaden whispered, disbelief creeping into his voice. He looked over at Lyra, who didn't seem the least bit surprised. "That's just the beginning," she said, her voice cold and focused. "They'll be back, and we need to finish this." With the pursuing ship temporarily disabled, Lyra pushed the Nomad into overdrive, sending them further into the darkness of space, hoping to gain some distance. The sound of alarms blared again, warning them that their shields were weakening, but Lyra's skill at flying through the void kept them just out of reach of the enemy. Seconds turned into minutes, and the tension only grew. There was no time to relax. Every second felt like an eternity, and Kaden could feel the weight of the moment, the fear pressing against his chest. But as they drifted further away, Lyra finally allowed herself to exhale, the tension in her posture slightly relaxing. "We're not out of danger yet," she said, her voice still laced with urgency. "But that was a good hit, Kaden. We've got a chance." Kaden nodded, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps as the adrenaline started to wear off. He was still processing the fact that they had just fought off an unknown enemy. He had never imagined anything like this in his life. And yet here he was alive and still in one piece, sitting next to an alien woman who had pulled him into her world of survival and war. "That was insane," he said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "How did you dash?" "Not now," Lyra interrupted, her voice cutting through the chaos. She glanced back at him, eyes narrowed. "They won't give up that easily. We have to move quickly." She turned back to the controls, her hands moving with ease, navigating the Nomad through a series of evasive maneuvers. "Hold tight. We need to lose them for good. If they're not dead, they'll come after us again." Kaden gripped the seat, trying to steady himself as the ship twisted and turned, dodging the faint signature of the enemy's ship, which was still hot on their trail. For a moment, it seemed like everything was going to implode. But just as the pursuing ship closed in again, Lyra made a sharp turn, disappearing into an asteroid field. The collision alarms went off, and the ship's sensors screamed at them as they narrowly avoided large chunks of rock, debris, and shrapnel from destroyed ships. Kaden's heart was in his throat as the ship skidded through the jagged obstacles, bouncing off a few rocks but staying in motion. He could hear Lyra swearing under her breath as she maneuvered through the field with deadly precision. This was her world, a world where every move mattered, where survival depended on skill. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the pursuing ship's signatures began to fade. Lyra's grip loosened on the controls, and the tension in the cockpit finally began to dissipate. "We did it," Caden muttered, his voice filled with relief, but there was still an edge of uncertainty. Lyra didn't respond right away. She simply stared ahead, her expression unreadable. It was clear to Caden that this was just one battle in a much larger war. They hadn't won yet. Not by a long shot. Chapter 4. The Cost of Survival. The aftermath of the fight left both of them feeling physically drained, yet neither of them could afford to relax. Lyra immediately went to work, patching up the ship's systems, checking for any structural damage from the attack. Caden helped where he could, following her instructions without asking questions. But every time he looked at her, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her, more than just the assassin, more than the woman who had pulled him into this life. The danger wasn't over. The enemy, the wardens, would come again. Lyra knew it, Caden knew it, and in that moment, they both knew they had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. In the quiet after the battle, Lyra turned to him, her expression softening for the first time since they had met. "Thank you, Caden," she said quietly, her voice tinged with something more than gratitude. "You didn't have to help me, but you did." Caden stood there for a moment, his hands still trembling from the fight. "You didn't leave me much choice," he said, a weak smile tugging at his lips. "But I think I'm in this now, whether I like it or not." Lyra nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, though she quickly wiped them away. "There's no turning back. But if you stay with me, we can make it through this. Together." Caden met her gaze, feeling a strange sense of peace settle within him. The chaos of the past few days had turned his world upside down, but he couldn't deny the pull she had on him. The survival instinct inside of him had kicked in, and now, for the first time in a long time, he had someone to fight for. Together, he agreed. The two of them stood there, on the precipice of something far greater than either of them could understand. The galaxy was vast, the threats were many, but together, they would face it all, fighting not just to survive, but to make sure they had a future. As the Nomad glided deeper into the unknown, the stars outside the viewport flickered, distant and cold, just as the fate that lay ahead was uncertain. But in that moment, one thing was clear: they would face it, side by side.